Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name is Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passage's resident scholar, Josiah McGee. In recent months, you may have heard a lot about UNRWA. UNRWA stands for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Refugees of Palestine. UNRWA has come under much controversy recently due to many UNRWA employees' involvement with Hamas, or even taking part in the October 7th attacks on Israel. So today, we're unpacking what UNRWA exactly is and what is their relationship to Israel. So Josiah, can you tell us when UNRWA was created and how exactly it was created?
Yeah, so UNRWA, this is a fascinating topic, especially given Israel's decision to sort of cancel their contract, if you will, with UNRWA. I think this is going to be a very good conversation, but one there's a lot of history and dates and facts. We'll try to share as much as we can, contextualize, and hopefully this all makes sense. But it is a subsidiary, technically, of the UN General Assembly. So the United Nations is an organization that has a wide variety of different agencies and whatnot, some of which report to the General Assembly, others to other branches like the Security Council. But UNRWA reports essentially to the UN General Assembly. It is one of two that report directly to the General Assembly. It was they sort of, I don't know if you want to call it legislative branch of the United Nations, that kind of thing. It was created by the UN General Assembly resolution. There's a resolution 302 which created it, and this was passed in December of 1948 in response to the Arab-Israeli War that started in 1948. The Israeli War for Independence has different names, but it really didn't begin operating more formally until 1950. So it was sort of created in theory or technically created in 1948, but didn't actually do a lot till 1950. But this resolution that was passed by the United Nations General Assembly laid out a few things like its responsibilities. It also laid out some plans for funding the organization, the work that it would do. It was asking different countries to voluntarily contribute funds to it, as well as giving a small portion of the organization's budget from the UN General Assembly's budget. And it was also sort of created with this timeline in mind. It didn't have a specific timeline, but it also wasn't given an indefinite mandate that it should last forever. It was created basically with this idea that it would be required to renew its mandate if it did want to continue working indefinitely. So it was created with the expectation that there would be periodic timelines in which you would have to sort of discuss whether to renew the mandate until its services were no longer necessary, was the hope. That obviously hasn't happened. It's continued to operate ever since 1948 and is continually renewed every time that deadline comes up, because it apparently still has services to provide which are considered necessary by the UN General Assembly.
So we briefly mentioned that UNRWA works directly with refugees of Palestine. That is in their name. That's the population that they are working with. So can you tell us why UNRWA was originally created?
Yeah, so at the end of the sort of Israeli War for Independence, the 1948-49 war, and obviously it was created in December of 1948, so the war wasn't even technically over yet at this point, but the UN General Assembly recognized that there was going to be a significant problem. There was going to be a massive refugee problem, and this problem was on both sides, frankly. The Jewish state did absorb many Jewish refugees, hundreds of thousands, from around the Middle East after it was born and started to organize itself. But there was really no Palestinian state created by this war. As you know, in 1948 and 49, the State of Israel was founded, but the Palestinian state was not. The Palestinians were left at the end of this war under the jurisdiction of different Arab governments, like the Jordanians or the Egyptians. And there was no Palestinian state to absorb Palestinian refugees, of which there were also hundreds of thousands. The Arab countries were not particularly interested in absorbing them. Some of them did absorb a few, but only on a temporary basis. They didn't really want to keep them. It was more, you can come, but eventually you're going to have to go somewhere else, ideally back to where you came from, kind of thing. So there's just this big problem. You have hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees that no one seems to want, and they don't have a state of their own to absorb them the same way that Jewish refugees were absorbed into Israel. So they had to create some sort of mechanism to take care of these Palestinians and to provide for their basic needs. The problem is that the UN itself also didn't have a refugee agency yet dedicated to solving refugee crises and dealing with these sort of things. Later, they created the UNHCR, which is the main agency today that is responsible for most major refugee crises. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, I think. But that didn't exist yet. And so they had to create on the fly some sort of solution to this problem. And UNRWA was that solution. It was created to fill an immediate gap and a need to provide humanitarian assistance to Palestinian refugees. Over time, because the refugee crisis wasn't really solved, they weren't resettled elsewhere, they weren't returned to their homes where they lived prior to the 1948 and 49 war, it sort of assumed more responsibility. Like, it started to develop infrastructure in refugee camps that today are basically cities. They're major refugee camps that are as large as and operate like cities. And UNRWA started to take on more responsibilities like running educational systems, building schools, providing educational resources like curriculum for the schools, that sort of thing. So it started at a pretty basic set of responsibilities, and over time just started accumulating more because the original purpose for which it was created, it sort of outgrew that when the refugees weren't resettled.
So you talked a little bit about UNHCR, which is responsible for other refugee crises. So what makes the UNHCR different than UNRWA? So UNRWA is still responsible for Palestinians, but why wouldn't the Palestinians be the responsibility of UNHCR? And why is UNRWA still working directly with Palestinians and not UNHCR?
It's a good question why the Palestinian refugee problem hasn't been transferred to the UNHCR. I think there's definitely some politics involved there in terms of what people think should be done with the Palestinian refugees. But there's a couple of key differences between UNRWA and the UNHCR that are helpful to understand. The first one being the basic mandates of both organizations, what they are tasked with doing. And then the second one being the way that they define refugees. So UNRWA's mandate is only to provide temporary humanitarian assistance. They were not given the responsibility to resettle Palestinian refugees, just to take care of them until a solution could be found, a permanent solution could be found for these Palestinian refugees. The UNHCR does provide humanitarian assistance, of course, for different refugees, and I've actually visited some of the camps for Syrian refugees where they do these things. But it also has a responsibility to seek more long-term solutions, like permanent resettlement in third countries. So it operates on the basis of assuming that most refugees are, fleeing for a reason. They need asylum. They won't be able to return to their homes where they came from. And so it actually has responsibilities to evaluate and help host countries evaluate, do these asylum cases actually have credibility, and do we need to resettle them somewhere else? In many cases, in the Syrian crisis, for example, that was in Europe or in North America. UNRWA doesn't assume that most Palestinian refugees need to be resettled elsewhere. It assumes that they will return to their place of origin, and then it has a very limited mandate to just take care of them until they go home. It doesn't have a mandate or assume that it needs to or has a responsibility to move Palestinian refugees somewhere else. So what this implies is that the UN still prefers that Palestinian refugees not be resettled, but rather return to their place of origin, which again is where I say this. The politics begin to sort of play into this a little bit. You can understand why UNRWA is taking care of them, not UNHCR, is because the UN appears to have some priorities or preferences in terms of where Palestinian refugees eventually wind up. Unlike most refugees that are taken care of by the UNHCR, they would rather not find them new homes. They'd rather just send them back to where they came from. Now, the definition of refugee is also pretty distinct in some ways between UNRWA and the UNHCR. The UNHCR defines a refugee as someone who is unwilling or unable to return to their country due to a well-founded fear of persecution. So we've just talked about this a little bit. In many cases, the type of refugee that the UNHCR is working with is someone who eventually is going to claim some sort of political or religious asylum or something elsewhere. They're unlikely that they'll be able to go home. And that's how they define the type of person that qualifies for their services. Common recent examples, which I've already listed, for example, would be Syrian refugees or various internal conflicts in African countries. make it to the headlines as frequently as issues like the Syrian civil war, but there's a lot of refugees in various conflicts in Africa as a result of very, very similar circumstances. UNRWA defines Palestinian refugees differently. It doesn't define them as this person who is unwilling or unable to return to their country. It defines them as someone who lived in Palestine between June 1, 1946 and May 15, 1948. It defines a Palestinian refugee as one who lost their home and their means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict. It defines them as a descendant of a Palestine refugee male, including adopted children, which is very interesting, and people displaced by the 1967 war, subsequent hostilities, and other people who needed humanitarian assistance as a result of these conflicts. So these are pretty wide-ranging. It allows a much broader array of people from different circumstances to claim refugee status than the UNHCR does. And it's not just someone who was displaced or is unwilling or unable to go home. It's also all of the descendants of people who were displaced by the 1948 conflict. So that means that it snowballs very quickly. I mean, the UNHCR is processing massive numbers of refugees, but if they were processing every single descendant of the Syrian conflict, for example, regardless of whether they had been resettled elsewhere yet or not, you can only imagine just the massive numbers they would be processing. And that's what UNRWA is trying to do, is they're trying to process not just the original refugees, but also every person who descends from or is adopted by a family that was displaced in 1948.
Wow. That's a very fascinating distinction between UNHCR and UNRWA, and it definitely helps me understand a lot better the different responsibilities and why UNRWA is so unique in the space that it's working in. So going back to UNRWA, who is funding UNRWA, and where is it getting this funding from?
Yeah, so a small amount comes from the UN's general budget. It's allocated by General Assembly and that sort of thing. A lot of it comes from international donations. Actually, the majority of it comes from international donations from different countries, especially the United States, different European partners. The U.S. support has not been constant. When we do provide support, it tends to be a significant percentage of UNRWA's overall budget, though. In the last 3 years during the Biden administration, we gave over $1 billion to UNRWA. So it's not a small amount of money that UNRWA relies upon its international partners in different countries to provide.
So recently, a lot of the controversy with UNRWA specifically involves UNRWA's operations in the Gaza Strip. So can you clarify for us where exactly UNRWA is operating and when did it start cooperating with Israel?
Yeah, so prior to 1967, there's a very different story. 1967 really is where they start cooperating with Israel or having to work with Israel. So if you back up before that, it was already operating in different countries, Arab host countries, where you could find these Palestinian refugees like Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, which was under Jordanian control, Gaza, which was under Egyptian control, these sorts of places. And again, it's important to note that most of these countries were not enthusiastic about absorbing Palestinian refugees permanently. They were sort of temporarily hosting them. That was their preference, at least. So UNRWA was working in all these different places where you could find Palestinian refugees prior to 1967. After the Six-Day War in 1967, UNRWA had to work not just with these Arab host countries, but also with Israel, because Israel all of a sudden had jurisdiction over and control of the Gaza Strip that it took from Egypt, and the West Bank that it took from Jordan. And there were large numbers of refugees in these places. So in 1967, Israel and UNRWA reached an agreement, a diplomatic agreement, by exchanging letters that formed sort of this contract, if you will, between the two of them, or this understanding or this arrangement between Israel and UNRWA that they would cooperate to continue providing humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian refugees. I have made some notes here because it's a pretty extensive list of the different agreements they made back and forth, but I'll just read off a few so you get a taste for some of what they were having to sort of negotiate over after the Six-Day War. at a basic level, the ask that Israel made of UNRWA was that they would just continue doing your work, continue helping the Palestinian refugees, and please don't go, stay, keep doing what you're doing, that kind of thing. In exchange, there was a lot of things that Israel was supposed to do for UNRWA. So it was supposed to help protect UNRWA's personnel, property, and installations. Israel had military control over the Gaza Strip and West Bank, so it was very natural that it would be responsible to provide for the security of different organizations in those territories like UNRWA. Israel would help to permit UNRWA vehicles freedom of movement, so basically ensure that they were able to actually get in and out of the different areas in which they worked, including if they need to getting in and out of Israel and access to the Gaza Strip and West Bank from Israel. It would give UNRWA international staff the same freedom of movement and issue the required ID documents so they could get in and out of different territories when they needed to. It would permit local staff freedom of movement within areas like Gaza Strip and West Bank. So basically, Israel would allow, if there was someone from Europe who worked for UNRWA, they would issue them an ID document that allowed them to travel in and out of the Gaza Strip and West Bank and into Israel from the Gaza Strip and West Bank and vice versa. Local staff, like local Palestinian staff, they would give them ID documents that allowed them the ability to move freely within the Gaza Strip, but not necessarily, from the Gaza Strip to Israel and then back, that sort of thing. So it would basically facilitate their ability to move freely within the areas in which they were actually working if they were not members of some other country, like a European country or a citizen of a European country. They would also do all of this in coordination with the military authorities, again, because Israel had military control over these areas now. Israel would provide radio, telecommunications, and landing facilities. It would maintain previously existing financial arrangements with the governmental authorities that were responsible for the areas in question. So examples would be, there were agreements that exempted UNRWA from different taxes or, tariffs, customs, charges on imports, that sort of thing. Israel was expected to provide, free warehousing and labor for offloading and handling and transport for different humanitarian shipments and that sort of thing. And it was expected to basically cover the costs that UNRWA had been expecting, Egypt or Jordan to cover for them prior to 1967. So Israel assumed a lot of responsibilities, a significant amount of costs and commitments to meet various obligations. There's a few things I think are really important to note about this. One, the agreement was provisional. So when we get to the controversy about Israel recently canceling this agreement with UNRWA and people questioning, like, can they do that? Are they allowed to just cancel an agreement like that? And the answer is yes. Like, it was pretty explicit within the original agreement. It was in effect only till it was replaced or canceled, meaning that either UNRWA or Israel could cancel this agreement and then it would no longer be in effect. Israel needed UNRWA at the time because, you've just fought the 6-day war and all of a sudden you're responsible for so many Palestinians that you were not a few days before. Israel was not ready to take care of all these Palestinians, so it needed UNRWA at the time. But it agreed to a lot in order to guarantee that UNRWA would continue to help them. And this is part of why Israel sort of grew frustrated with UNRWA over time, because they felt like they were being taken advantage of by the fact that they had a need and UNRWA offered to help them meet that need. But then UNRWA turned around and allegedly became complicit in different terror activity and that sort of thing. And so Israel kind of felt stabbed in the back by this process because they, as we've outlined, agreed to do so many things for UNRWA in exchange for their help. And then, UNRWA didn't actually help Israel. They sort of made the problem worse, allegedly, and engaged in some violence against Israel.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that context. I think the last few notes about Israel canceling its agreement with UNRWA kind of leads me to my next question. UNRWA has, like we earlier mentioned, come under a lot of controversy, and it's been talked about almost solely in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm curious your thoughts on what is the impact that UNRWA has on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So supporters will argue that it still fills important gaps. As frustrated as Israel might be with their ineffectiveness or the way that they sort of take advantage of the situation, its supporters of UNRWA are going to argue, Israel still needs it. It does still fill important gaps. It provides services that the Palestinian National Authority either cannot or will not provide for Palestinians because of internal politics between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, for example. And it absolves Israel of certain responsibilities that it inherited in 1967. Absolves is maybe not exactly the right word, because when people argue that, that implies that, Israel doesn't have any responsibility if UNRWA were to suddenly disappear, and it does. If UNRWA disappears, Israel would then be responsible for what UNRWA has been providing the Palestinians, at least to a certain degree in the areas that it still controls. But that's where the supporters land on this issue. The critics argue that there are several problems with UNRWA. In addition to this whole, Israel's being asked to do too much in exchange for too little argument, you also have arguments like this is enabling corruption and neglect within the Palestinian Authority. Why does the UN Refugee Agency still need to take care of Palestinians if a Palestinian National Authority was created with the assumption that it would gradually acquire more and more responsibility and prove itself competent and ready to lead a Palestinian state? Does the international community, the UN, really need to be taking care of these refugees, or are they just allowing the Palestinian National Authority to make excuses for why they're not taking care of Palestinians instead? It's a fair question. There's some issues there that definitely need to be addressed a little bit, I think. You also have other issues that will come up all the time as it relates to, what is the impact of this on the nature of this question of right of return. So right of return basically is the idea that Palestinian refugees have a right to return home to their homes that they lived in 1948, 1949. And it's a very common demand of Palestinians when they are negotiating with Israel that Palestinian refugees have the right to return to the places where they came from. Critics of this argument and critics of UNRWA, like Dr. Einat Wilf, for example, is an example of a scholar who's written quite a bit on the subject, argues that both UNRWA's existence and this insistence on preserving the idea of a Palestinian refugee's right to return actually prolongs the refugee crisis, and by extension the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it is sort of at the core of Palestinian demands during the negotiations. Her argument essentially is that, UNRWA does not make efforts to resettle refugees, which just means that they're stuck in limbo for, at this point now, we're talking many decades that they've been just stuck, honestly. It also classifies, as we've just mentioned a few minutes ago, not just originally displaced people, but also their descendants as refugees, which just exponentially increases the size of the problem of Palestinian refugees and the number of refugees that you have to figure out how to help. And practically what it means is that the work of UNRWA and the way that UNRWA defines the issues that it's trying to solve means that what was originally several 100,000 Palestinian refugees is now closer to 7 million. Expecting Israel to absorb 7 million refugees is an inherent obstacle to peace. It's never going to happen. Israel's never going to agree to that because it would destroy the state of Israel to absorb 7 million people. Israel's too small to do that. UNRWA, on the other hand, isn't really putting any pressure on Palestinian leadership to compromise on this issue. If anything, it helps them sort of wait out the problem indefinitely and keep everybody, both Israel and the Palestinian leadership and Palestinian refugees, waiting in limbo because nobody's willing to budge on this issue. And nobody needs to budge if the UN is going to keep taking care of these refugees indefinitely with no end in sight. So the argument that she makes is that this is actually harmful. The work that UNRWA does and the way that it goes about it, the way that it defines the issues and the scope of its project is actually, in her mind, prolonging the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, thank you for sharing that insight. That's definitely very helpful in understanding kind of the history of where some of this controversy is coming from. So now I want to ask you about something that in recent months has really put Israel under a lot of criticism, and that is Israel canceling its contract with UNRWA.
Yeah, the elephant in the room.
Yes. So why did Israel do that? Why would they cancel the contract with UNRWA?
Because, I mean, in addition to all of the issues we've already laid out, Israel feeling like the contract is no longer fair, Israel feeling like it's sort of enabling corruption within the PA, Palestinian Authority, or prolonging the refugee crisis. And again, on top of all those issues, you also have issues like UNRWA being accused of, as we've also mentioned, I think a little bit, being infiltrated by Hamas and its terror activities, maybe being complicit in some ways, certain employees actually engaging in violence. And so that is a very serious issue that Israel, it's shocking, but also something that Israel takes very seriously. And of course, it would make sense that they would. It also includes different examples of anti-Semitic curriculum that's teaching Palestinian children to hate Israel, or employing terrorists, diverting resources to terror organizations like Hamas, allowing facilities to be used by organizations like Hamas, even if the employees themselves are not shooting rockets, like is UNRWA allowing Hamas to shoot rockets from their facilities. I mean, all kinds of issues that when you look at them all together, it forms one big picture that it just looks really bad. And so Israel felt like it was forced to cancel the agreement.
Yeah. So at this point in our conversation, we've kind of taken a look back at the history of UNRWA, why UNRWA was created, what its purpose is.
Yeah.
So now I want to kind of transition to talk more about the current state of UNRWA, and particularly many UNRWA employees' involvement with Hamas. And this is something, like you said, that Israel has taken extremely seriously, because it is very serious. Many people were harmed by Hamas, and those Hamas workers were employed by UNRWA or had an association with UNRWA to some extent. So to kind of start off this section of our conversation, can you start by giving us some examples of UNRWA's involvement in the October 7th attacks and what happened after?
So there's both a before and after in terms of how UNRWA has been at this point proven to be, if not complicit, negligent in terms of its ability to combat terrorism, especially in the areas that it works. So I'll give some before and after examples of different things that UNRWA has been involved with. I think if we start with let's start with the employees, for example. So at this point, not even UNRWA denies that there was, not a massive, but not a small number either of UNRWA employees that participated in the October 7th attacks. They did their own investigation, actually, and found some of the allegations to be credible. There's some controversy over why they were not turned over to any particular authorities, these employees, for trial, that sort of thing. But UNRWA did acknowledge, okay, yes, these employees have been disciplined, fired, whatever, because it's true. Like, some of them did participate in October 7th, and UNRWA is not going to deny that. The question is, how many UNRWA employees are still compromised? So we're looking at after October 7th. How does this play into what's going on at UNRWA? There are still a lot of questions about, okay, great. So you did your investigation, you confirmed certain allegations about what happened on October 7th, but what about after the fact? How many of your employees still work for both UNRWA and Hamas at the same time? When Sinwar was killed, for example, an UNRWA ID was found on his body. So there are some very deep issues, obviously. This was nearly a year after the October 7 attacks when Israel finally killed Sinwar, and you're still finding evidence of some infiltration or integration between UNRWA and Hamas if the leader of Hamas in Gaza is carrying around an UNRWA ID. So there's a lot that's still to be unpacked in terms of what's going on now after October 7. The degree of infiltration it's hard to unpack exactly just how deep it goes, because it's not just one segment of UNRWA. It's multiple segments of UNRWA that appear to be infiltrated. You had some participants in the October 7 attacks were social workers, others were teachers. Now, they're coming from different branches of the organization in Gaza, so it seems to be a pretty widespread issue, and that's part of why it's hard to get to the bottom of it and figure out, okay, how deep does this actually go? What's the actual total number of UNRWA employees that were compromised by Hamas? It brings us, I think, to schools and curriculums. The fact that some teachers participated in the October 7 attacks should be a red flag, but also, it makes sense to a certain degree, because a lot of the curriculum that UNRWA was creating for the schools that were being taught to Palestinian children were very anti-Semitic and
Mm-hmm.
were being used to intentionally teach hate against Israel. So you see, for example, in March of 2024, Times of Israel published a report by the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education. It's a very long name for this organization. But that report found the following examples in some UNRWA curriculums. I'll just give you a few examples. One being there's a map of the Middle East in a geography book that makes no mention of the state of Israel, showing Palestine in its place only. I mean, that's fairly obvious what you're trying to communicate there. Israel doesn't have a right to exist.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that has a right to exist here is Palestine. There's a history book that narrates a 1968 battle between the Israeli army, the Jordanians, and the Palestinian Fedayeen, or resistance fighters, extolling the latter's courage in wearing explosive belts and praising the image of a burnt Zionist soldier. So, again, I mean, the imagery is very clear. It's very obvious what they're trying to teach here. They're glorifying violence in these various textbooks that are being given to Palestinian children. A chemistry book was used asking students to analyze the types of chemicals contained in phosphorus bombs, which were allegedly dropped by Israel. An Islamic studies book described the goals of jihad as terrorizing the enemy and achieving martyrdom. So there it's even more explicit. The goal is not just to see Jews harmed, but to encourage students to create this sort of religious framework through which they would justify the use of violence.
Yeah.
And also not just that, but demonizing the Jews in the process, so that it's clear why they are the specific target of this violence.
Yeah.
This is all just very, very hard to deny evidence.
Yeah.
It's out there, it's public, you can't deny it. Very clear examples, practical examples to make it clear that Hamas was not the only one radicalizing Palestinians in Gaza, first and foremost. And second, if UNRWA has been doing that, it's in the classroom, radicalizing Palestinian children, that sort of thing, of course, it makes all the sense in the world why a teacher employed by UNRWA would participate in the October 7 attacks, because they're spending their days teaching Palestinian children to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's really obvious that it goes very deep and it's very widespread. It's just hard to pin down without taking apart the entire organization. Like, how deep does this actually go?
Yeah. Wow, those are some really serious and honestly quite horrific examples, to think that young children are going to school being taught hatred from such a young age, and also to think that UNRWA, which is associated with the United Nations, an organization that is supposed to be dedicated to human rights and good, has been involved in this kind of hatred. It's quite serious, and it definitely, like you said, provides a little more context to just how serious the attacks of October 7th were from an ideological standpoint. So I want to talk a little bit now about Hamas's use of UNRWA facilities.
Sure.
So can you tell us a little bit about how Hamas has been using these facilities and some of the claims that they have been using these facilities that Israel has made?
So Israel's argument, and this comes up all the time when Israel, for example, launches an airstrike on or near a UN facility in the Gaza Strip, and then of course there's condemnation and there's outrage, like, why would Israel do that, and that sort of thing. And Israel's response, generally speaking, is the reason we did it is because these facilities are not peaceful facilities. They don't have any sort of diplomatic status because Hamas is using them as basis for terrorism. And there's a question of, how does Hamas accomplish this? And how do we know that Hamas is actually accomplishing this? I think in terms of answering why it would be feasible, it's pretty easy to see how it would be feasible for Hamas to do this, because if Hamas can easily infiltrate the employee ranks of UNRWA, access to facilities is a no-brainer. That would be relatively easy to accomplish. And it's pretty easy to understand, again, if they're working hand in hand to take care of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, because Hamas also does do some public work, social work, that kind of thing, like UNRWA does, that they're going to be working side by side all the time. And Hamas is going to be even non-employees of UNRWA, Hamas members are going to be in and out of UNRWA facilities frequently. They would just make all the sense in the world that that would be the case. Now, unfortunately, it seems like Hamas is using many of those facilities for things other than public services or social work. They have their own agenda. And what's happened is Israel's conducted their operation in the Gaza Strip is that they've actually found tangible evidence that these things are happening, that Hamas is using these facilities for its own purposes. It's not entirely clear whether it's Hamas members just walking in and out because they can, or whether it's UNRWA employees who are also associated with Hamas. But what they have found is that somebody is storing weapons for Hamas in UNRWA facilities. There's many examples of this. They're also finding that Hamas has repeatedly fired weapons either from inside or very close to these different UNRWA facilities. So if there's a vacant lot next to an UNRWA school that Hamas uses to fire a rocket, and Israel, drops some sort of munitions on this vacant lot, UNRWA might claim that it's inappropriate because there's a school next door, but Israel's response is going to be, well, the school is not really a school. It's a cover for Hamas terrorism because they're using your facilities for their own purposes.
Yeah. And I think when somebody hears that Israel attacked an UNRWA school or an UNRWA facility, of course someone would be outraged at that, if you think that it's just a school or just a facility or just a hospital or whatever the facility might be. But it just really shows the level of corruption that Hamas would be using humanitarian aid, using a humanitarian aid organization as a cover. And it affects both Palestinian civilians, Israeli civilians. So it really does highlight just another level of corruption. So there has been a lot of claims that UNRWA has been diverting its own resources directly to Hamas. So how do we actually know that this is happening?
This is a little more complicated because there's not like there's a smoking gun that just makes it super obvious that this happens. Most people are just sort of connecting the dots going, okay, if UNRWA gets this much money but delivers this many services, there's a gap here somehow. So something's off. and where's that money all going, that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of that, like there's some smoke which would suggest that somewhere there's a fire, but it's hard to actually find the fire, if that makes sense, or the solid proof of where exactly UNRWA may be diverting resources. There are some cases that are a little bit more complicated and harder to follow. So we can go through one example of a lawsuit that happened recently that sort of laid out a case for how they think UNRWA is inadvertently helping Hamas, and maybe it's not for the purpose of helping Hamas, but just they're just being negligent and it's happening. So we can go through that example if you want, but it is a little bit tricky to follow. So I'll try to break it down as best as I can based on how I understand it. But basically, there was a lawsuit. It was actually from earlier this year, earlier in 2024. Victims of Hamas filed a lawsuit against Hamas officials, and not Hamas officials, excuse me, against UNRWA officials, and they made the case that UNRWA might be inadvertently financing Hamas. They're basically putting cash in their hands and therefore contributing to the terrorism that Hamas carries out. And the argument that they made essentially, which is, again, a little tricky to follow, but we'll do our best. UNRWA has an office in the United States, which frequently wires money to Jordan or the West Bank. So it's a subsidiary, like we said, of the UN General Assembly. So they have an office in New York. They will frequently wire money to different offices in Jordan or the West Bank where UNRWA also operates, or rather to banks near those offices in Jordan or the West Bank. The US dollars are typically then passed around a couple of times to different banks until they're withdrawn as cash and then transferred to the Gaza Strip. So there's not really a great bank in the Gaza Strip where you can just wire money to. You have to wire money to other banks around the Middle East and then find a way to withdraw cash from those banks, put it on a truck, and then drive it to the Gaza Strip so that you can deliver cash in person to UNRWA employees in the Gaza Strip who need to be paid. You have to pay your employees. It's given to them in U.S. currency denominations. So UNRWA employees or other recipients of the cash, whoever UNRWA is giving these U.S. dollars to payment of services or whatever, they then have to exchange it for shekels because you can't really easily spend U.S. dollars in the Gaza Strip. Most of the economy in the Gaza Strip is still run off of the Israeli shekel, actually. So they have to go find somewhere to exchange it. And what the lawsuit is arguing is that that's where Hamas enters the picture. Because Hamas was effectively running the Gaza Strip for so long, it controlled all of the money exchange processes. And because UNRWA, for some reason, was paying all of its employees in US dollars and not in Israeli shekels, UNRWA then was able to basically force every UNRWA employee, or Hamas was able to force every UNRWA employee to work with them to exchange those dollars into shekels, take a very large fee in exchange for that service, and then build themselves a US dollar cash reserve. Why does that matter? Well, Hamas can't necessarily spend Israeli shekels in order to conduct a lot of its more illicit operations. A lot of its terror work or smuggling operations, that kind of thing, you can't pay the Egyptian authorities to look the other way. If you're smuggling things through Rafah in shekels, you have to pay them US dollars because it's more internationally recognized currency. So Hamas needs US dollars in order to get done a lot of its illegal activity. And the charge or the accusation essentially is that UNRWA's decision to pay its employees in US dollars, not in shekels, allowed Hamas to create this money laundering scheme, essentially, that built themselves a U.S. cash reserve and funded their terror operations. The lawsuit claims, in their estimation, that Hamas potentially made up to $1 billion doing this.
Wow.
U.S. dollars. Maybe more, given how much money that the U.S. has given UNRWA over the years. And that's a lot. I mean, you can imagine the amount of tunnel infrastructure, for example, that could build for Hamas, or the amount of smuggling operations that could fund it. It's a very serious issue. I think it's really important to state, this is just one example of people trying to put the pieces together and figure out, where's all the money going? How is it being spent? Why did there seem to be different holes or weird situations here or whatever? It hasn't been proven. So this is an attempt to try and figure it out. Where all the discrepancies are coming from, this hasn't been proven true in a court of law. I will say, I think based on the way that it's laid out, some of the different evidence and timelines of how this whole process works and how it evolved, it's plausible. I think this is a very plausible scenario that this is how Hamas made a lot of its money. And if that's true, it does raise some pretty serious questions about why is UNRWA dealing in U.S. cash currency as opposed to local cash currency when it pays its employees? Is there a reason why UNRWA themselves could not exchange the money before giving it to the employees so that Hamas never had access to U.S. currency? I don't know. There probably is more to the story, but these are some examples of just how complicated the debate over this issue gets, and where people are trying to figure out to what degree is UNRWA responsible or not for some of these issues.
Yeah. Wow, that is certainly very complex, but thank you so much for explaining that to us.
Sure.
So we've talked a little bit about the past, the definition of UNRWA, how it began, why it began. We've talked about the current state of UNRWA, the controversies surrounding UNRWA, Israel canceling their contract with UNRWA. So now I want to kind of take a look towards the future. So what do you think, everything that we've discussed today, what do you think this means for the future of UNRWA?
Well, it'll certainly struggle to operate if Israel does not have an agreement with it to facilitate transfers, to facilitate the safety of UNRWA employees, to provide all the different services and facilities that Israel is supposed to give UNRWA under the previous agreement. It's going to be very challenging for UNRWA to continue to operate unless other organizations or countries step up and fill some of those gaps. The flip side of that is that it will, on the other hand, also create, I think, an increased burden on Israel to figure out, what do we do without UNRWA? Israel's argument to a certain degree is that UNRWA had become not that important, actually, that the percentage of humanitarian assistance being given to Palestinians had dropped pretty significantly in terms of what percentage UNRWA provided versus other organizations. So Israel's stance is kind of like, it wasn't actually that important. We can get by without them. But regardless of the specific degree, percentage, or amount of humanitarian aid that UNRWA was responsible for versus others, it's still going to be an increased burden on Israel. Even if it's a small one, it's still more responsibility on Israel to figure out how to guarantee that different humanitarian needs are being met in areas in which they still exercise any sort of control. In Gaza right now, until there's a solid day after plan when someone takes over after Hamas, hopefully, and if the IDF is eventually able to leave, someone's got to take over, and it's Israel's going to have some responsibility to figure out, okay, if it's not Hamas and if it's not UNRWA, then who's going to provide for the services in Gaza, unless Israel wants to stay and do it themselves. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated issue, and it solves one problem, canceling the agreement, like getting rid of a bad partner, but it also creates some other problems for Israel that they're going to have to eventually solve in canceling this agreement.
Yeah, for sure. Well, today we talked about a lot of really difficult and complex issues. We have UNRWA, an organization that is supposed to be assisting Palestinian refugees and advocating for their welfare, providing humanitarian aid and other services, that has become very connected to Hamas. And because of this, we've seen a lot of hurt, a lot of really difficult realities in both Israel and Palestine. And I think for all issues, but especially complex issues like this, it's important to look at it through your worldview, which for us would be a Christian worldview, and really for us to bring it back to our faith and how our Christian worldview instructs us to think about these things.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on how Christians should respond to the things that we've discussed today?
I think there's a few different things that Christians should think about. One, I don't want anyone's takeaway to be that we shouldn't care about the very real and continuing needs that face Palestinians. They do still have some pretty pressing humanitarian needs, especially those living in Gaza after the war that's just been fought, after Hamas's terror activity on October 7th. I mean, there's going to be some needs that do need to be met. Mm-hmm. And as Christians, I think we should continue to care about that. We should continue to care about the well-being of other people. And that should not change just because UNRWA has failed to do its job effectively. Now, the flip side of that is that we do need to be discerning. Just because people have needs that need to be met doesn't mean that we should support the first person who comes along and offers to meet those needs. It may be necessary to take a step back, think critically about who do we send money to? As Christians, one of the things that we often do is we support different causes, philanthropic causes. We send money to different charities, that kind of thing. And that's a good thing to do, but it's important, I think, for us to also be aware of, okay, who are we actually giving money to? Do they have a political agenda? And what is it? Are they trustworthy? Is there any reason to believe that they might not spend the money in the way that you expect them to, or on the things that you require them to? So you just need to be aware and responsible for, just because you give your money to someone else doesn't mean it's not your responsibility how they use it. We do have to be careful and thorough about thinking about how we steward the resources that we are given by God. Mm-hmm. We also, I think, just need to do our homework and try to be informed. We cannot exercise that level of responsibility and stewardship over our resources and care for the people around us if we are uninformed, if we are unaware about what's going on around us and some of the complexities. So first and foremost, I think we just have to be more willing to do the work of being informed so that we can make a positive difference when we get involved.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And I think sometimes doing the work in being informed can be difficult. It can be a lot more than just quickly glancing at a news headline or looking at a viral social media post involving the conflict in Israel and Gaza. It really does require us to be diligent in trying to stay informed. So thank you
Yeah.
today for helping us stay informed about what's happening right now with UNRWA. And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching today's episode. If you have questions about anything that we discussed today, feel free to leave a comment below, and we'd love to answer your question. If you're looking for more resources about things that we've discussed today or want to learn more about passages, check out the description below or follow us on Instagram for more content related to Israel and the Middle East. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.